Hey everyone, this is Lucas Bagno, an investor at Village Global, and I'm here with my co-host Ian Cinnamon. Welcome to Solarpunk.
In this podcast, we cover topics related to space and defense and discuss how technology can contribute to a better and safer world.
Hey everybody, we're really excited to have Raj Shah with us today on the show. Raj is the co-founder of Shield Capital, an investment firm focused on technologies applicable to both commercial and defense markets. He's also the chairman of Resilience, a cybersecurity startup. Most recently, he was a managing partner of the Pentagon's Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, the IUX, reporting to the Secretary of Defense. Raj led the IUX in its efforts to strengthen U.S. armed forces through contractual and cultural bridges between Silicon Valley and the Pentagon. Previously, Raj was Senior Director of Strategy at Palo Alto Networks, which acquired Morta Security, where he was Chief Executive Officer and co-founder. He began his business career as a consultant at McKinsey. Raj, welcome to the show.
Lucas, great to be here with you.
Amazing. Well, we're very excited to have you on. So, Raj, maybe to just kick us off, could you give us an overview of Shield Capital and the type of investments you're looking to make there?
So Shield Capital is something I've been working on and thinking about for many years. And it is a early stage venture fund focused on companies at the intersection of national security and commercial customers. And our thesis is that companies that can delight customers in both categories. One will outperform and be just great investment. But secondly, it will be really important for what I think is the greatest challenge of our generation, with this authoritarianism versus liberal Western democracies. And I've got the great benefit of working with an amazing set of colleagues who I've known for a very long time.
Incredible. When you're looking to make investment into companies building dual-use technologies, how do you evaluate whether or not the founders already have the experience in navigating government contracting? We've talked to a lot of speakers here that share a little bit more about the maze that it is working with the government. Well, from the investor hat, how much do you care about whether or not the founder knows how to go through that maze?
It's a great question. And so maybe I'll say two things. First off, we take an expansive view of what it means to be at this nexus. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the companies actually have to sell to the government or the intelligence communities, but just that influencing and interacting with them will give them an unfair advantage in the market. But more directly to your question, Lucas, is quite candidly, we don't care if our entrepreneurs have deep experience in selling to the government, if that's part of the business model. That's where we come in, because these skills of how to navigate take a really long time to learn, and you have to do it by having experience. And we've got guys in our team like a guy named David Rothside, who spent 13 years as an acquisition officer in the U.S. Air Force, ran all their software acquisitions, and so really knows the ins and outs. So we can bring that. And then, the other half of it, I think, to be a good investor is it helps to be an operator in startup world. And so if you look at our founding partners, three of us have gone from paper napkins to unicorn ourselves. So, more specifically, when we're looking at a company and we're evaluating it, we're really looking at three things. Not first and foremost is the team. Like, who are they? How have we known them? How passionate are they? As you guys both know, startups are hard, and you need someone that's going to fight through the difficulties that inevitably come up. So, who's the team, and what do we think about them? Then, of course, is the market. Is it big enough? And for us, it's what's the commercial side of it, because that is a critical piece for us. Because as much as I love the government and have spent years of my life making it easier to sell into government, it's still hard, and you want to have two pathways. And then thirdly, of course, is the technology. What are they building? What's their solution? Why are customers excited about it? So that's what we look at when we're considering partnering with a company.
So, Raj, a lot of the companies that end up being dual use tend to often involve hardware or not pure software. Recently, of course, we had this major economic downturn. We may or may not be in a recession. How has that affected these hard tech companies particularly the dual use ones, as opposed to pure software companies that might not be as applicable for dual use type roles?
Yeah, it's interesting. When you have these market downturns, which has been new for, I think, a lot of people in this ecosystem, the one good thing about the government is that their budgets don't also follow the markets, right? They're still going to spend. And in fact, if anything, they're going to spend more. So it's a great customer to have. And, traditionally, the places like the Department of Defense, for example, they know how to buy hardware more than they know how to buy software, though they're slowly, I think, maturing along that curve. And so I think it's a unique opportunity in time during a downturn, one for the government, right? So the government can say, I really want technology in these areas, even if they're hardware, and by being a good customer can influence the market perhaps more than they normally would, because traditionally they're a smaller buyer. On the entrepreneurial side, for company founders, if done right, and that's a big asterisk, because otherwise, if you don't do it right, you can waste a lot of time with the government. But if done right, the government can be a great customer and can provide essential revenue for that business while the private markets may be contracting. So I think this is again part of the thesis that we have of having companies that sit at that nexus will allow them to outperform in all market conditions.
So speaking of understanding how to make sure your companies are able to work well with the government, before you started Shield, you led DIU. We've also had Mike Brown on the podcast as well, who was also leading DIU. Tell us a little bit about your top takeaways and what are some of the lessons that you impart on your founders from that experience?
So I think there's a couple of things that I would focus on, the advice we give founders. First and foremost is be very judicious with your time and where you approach, right? The outside of running out of cash, right, the most limiting factor for a startup is time. You just have a small team, you have so much to do. Where are you going to spend your time? So be very, very careful as to which agencies and customers that you interface with, right? Because while the DoD is one big organization, it's not really one customer. It's probably 100 customers within there, maybe more, 1,000. And so selecting who's going to give you the most return for your time, I think is the number one. And number two is that, especially if you're not from there, or even if you are, get real help. Get help from an investor that knows it, get help from, other advisory groups, because you've got to line up who's got the money, who's got the contract, who's got the need, who's got the authority, who's got the timeline, and all this stuff has to magically come together at the right time for it to result in a contract for a startup. So I think really understanding that and navigating that is key. So get help. And then I think the thirdly, and the most the final one I give advice is, work on stuff that's really important. And by that, I mean stuff that is really going to make a measure of difference in operations, in how our men and women uniform do their jobs, and again helps our country and our allies and our partners be the deterrence against authoritarianism. And I think that's important for a couple of reasons. Like, one, it's just exciting. Your engineers are going to be excited. Like, you feel good when you come home, like you help make the world a better place. So I think that's really great. And then more from a business standpoint, those are the things that get the greatest attention. And so if you do a good job, people will see it because, it matters. Lives are on the line. And then that will, I think, create momentum from a business standpoint to grow. So those are kind of top three things I tell entrepreneurs.
Amazing. And Raj, when you look back, 6 to 8 years ago, when you were heading the Defense Innovation Unit, how would you evaluate the overall ecosystem, not just the IU, but the overall ecosystem when it comes to startups working in the government? How are things back then, and where are we at now?
Man, it's so different. It's like night and day. And so there's lots of complaining about acquisition reform, and I've written a bunch of stuff about that, but it is so much better than it was 6 to 8 years ago. So for example, when DIU X at the time was stood up, I think Ash Carter was the first sitting Secretary of Defense to come to the Valley ever, right? I think before that they had secretaries of war. They didn't even have secretary of defense, right? So he's the first one. And he comes here and he gives a big speech at Stanford and says, the DoD is open for business. We want to partner with you, because he had recognized the importance of that. In fact, had written a seminal paper in 2001 about it. So it was totally foreign for the department to come out here. Since World War II, historically, when the Valley was first started, actually it was for DoD problems, but it'd been a while. Startups traditionally had been advised by their investors to not work with the government. In fact, when I was running my very first startup, a cybersecurity one, our investors were like, stop wasting your time. It's going to hurt your valuation. And so it was a really difficult and tenuous situation where we had to bring these two worlds together to solve an important mission. And I'm just pleased to say the team that we had at DIUX, the support that we got from Secretary Carter and then Secretary Mattis was like unbelievable. And so now we're in a place where people are doing podcasts on this topic, right? There are countless venture firms, there are countless startups, there are groups trying to help optimize selling to the government. So it's a different place. We still have a long way to go. There's still a ton to be done, but I think people recognize the problem, right? No longer do we have to convince anyone that, hey, this stuff these Silicon Valley-esque type teams are building is going to be important for national defense. Like no one questions that. AI, commercial space, like it's here to stay. And the Ukraine conflict has just made that visible to everybody. So it's a lot better. Now we have to make it better on the margins and really now get to scale. The government needs to get to scale, and that's the challenge.
And can you dive deeper, Raj, into a few of these challenges? Like, what are the biggest challenges, and are they mostly due to bureaucracy, culture, mindset, staffing, process? Like, what are they?
All of the above, right? That's what makes it hard. If it was just an easy technology problem, or even just an easy, leadership problem, I think that could be more readily solved. I know you had Steve Blank earlier on your show, and I will steal one of his phrases, which, we have an amazing system built for a world that no longer exists. And that is true. Our budgeting system, how we do requirements, how we build the software or hardware and get it out to our warfighters, it's built for an industrial age where you're going to buy an aircraft carrier and keep it for 50 years. It's not built for a time cycle where 2 years from now, you can't predict what the software is going to look like if you fully define it. You're wrong from the beginning. So let me get more specifically. So what's the problem? To me, the problem is, how do we move at the speed and scale that's relevant to operationalize this commercial technology for national defense? My view and assertion is, again, outside of long lead hardware, that what's really going to differentiate one adversary from another, or one combatant from another, is not necessarily just the technology, but how fast you can adopt and operationalize some new technology, because technology is constantly changing much faster than it ever was. And so to do that, you've got to move at speed. And the second one is, okay, once you've gotten something, how do you scale it, right? We've got 1 million members in uniform, there's 3 million people in the Department of Defense. Like, it's a big org, right? How do you scale? And so I think the challenge for those two is that our structures and our processes are not built for that. So things like DIU, wonderful track record. Mike Brown's done just an amazing job with it. But it's sort of an out-of-band process. It's not the core process. And you can't lay blame on the executive branch or the Department of Defense alone. The legislative branch has an equal, if not greater, role to play. So I'm hopeful that the two branches will get together and figure out how to adapt and reform the processes. There's a commission that the legislature has put together called the Commission on Planning, Programming, Budget, and Execution Reform. I'm honored to have a seat on that commission, and we're trying to reform the processes that were established in the 50s to modernize it. But it's really a matter of scale and speed, and less than of new invention. I think we know how to solve it. We just have to have the will to do it.
To go one layer deep, Raj, how much of it, in terms of scale and speed, what are the specific things you think that the DoD should do, Congress, and then the executive office, the president?
Yeah, good question. So I think we have to fundamentally. So let's use an example, a specific example. I think we have to fundamentally look at software procurement differently than we look at hardware, long lead hardware procurement. The way the process traditionally works is you have some warfighters, soldiers, sailors, airmen that have a need. They talk to a requirements person who puts a list of things, who then sends it off to a program office that's going to go execute it and budget for it. Then you have an acquisition team that actually writes the contract and oversees it. And then you have the folks actually writing the software, building the hardware at the performer. And those two chains, like no one talks. Like normally the people building the software and the people using it don't talk. So I think we just need a different system for we think about software, low cost hardware. I think the way we do budgeting and the ability to be more iterative, start with a performer, start with multiple performers, down select, have milestones, be able to switch those contracts. So that's reformed a color of money, which is a abstract government concept we can get into, talk about the ability to cancel a contract and reappropriate those funds to someone else, being able to take your funds from one year, move them to another year. So there's some like basic structural budgeting things that seem pretty normal, commonplace in the private sector that for a host of reasons you can't do in the private sector. So it's starts with the planning process, the budgeting process, and of course the executive branch when they execute.
So let's take a look at where we are today and how government or how companies work with the government. When you have companies in your portfolio, without changing how the government is operating, what is your advice on the right process they should be using to work with the government? Are there certain contract vehicles or certain methods that you tell them to go down or to avoid? What's the advice that you give?
Yeah, so we give a couple pieces of advice. The first is to work with organizations that have the mandate and reputation of moving quickly. So that includes DIU, it includes InQtel, it includes AFWorks, and a couple of other specific program offices. So, focus your energy there is advice one. I think the second is to really have an eye on how and where this technology or solution is going to transition to something they call a program of record, right? So it's not a R&D, research and development, I wouldn't call it a science project, but sort of just prototype, where you'll do one of those and it's unclear where it goes, but having a clear pathway. So that's understanding who is they call it a program or PE, a program executive officer, like who actually is mandated by law to have this capability that you're trying to solve and has the budget for it, and how do you make sure that your capability has a shot? So near term and long term thinking sort of at the same time.
So what are the most common missteps that you're seeing smaller companies make when they try to compete for these government contracts?
Well, I mean, the most basic mistake I've seen is a startup will meet with a senior ranking uniform officer, a 3 or 4 star, who genuinely loves what they're building and knows that would make their forces better and stronger, and says, "Hey, Mr. Startup or Mrs. Startup, I love what you're building. This is so amazing. I can't wait to have it. Hey, come, I have my executive officer with me. They're going to follow up and figure this out." And so the startup gets really excited, spends some energy, spends a lot of time, has lots of conversations, but doesn't realize that the chances of that going to anywhere is absolutely zero. And those 20 meetings have been an utter waste of time. And not because anyone has bad intentions. It's just that's not how the process works, and their timeline and incentives are not aligned. So that's one of the most rookie ones I've seen. I mean, I think other things that you see is you win one of these small business innovation research grants called SBIRs, which is interesting. You get $1 million or $2 million from the government, which and if you're an early stage startup and you got that from a big Fortune 1000 company, right? You get really excited, and so they begin to move their product development roadmap toward those specific problem sets. Again, not realizing that it's actually not going anywhere past that. And that's probably the last contract you're getting. And again, waste a lot of product dev cycles. So that's another common one I see.
What's your take on consultants being used? It seems like most startups now are trying to figure out, oh, we need to hire a consultant to, do AppWorks or SpaceWorks or even, STPRs, all these different programs. How do you think about that?
In all things, there's good ones and there's bad ones. I always find that whenever you look at anything in life, or particularly in business, if you can align incentives, it's the best. And so if the consultant has the same incentive, meaning it's shared success, they don't get compensated until you win, that makes it easier versus someone charging you a large fee. I mean, I think that's the difference that we try to take the approach. We're very committed to our companies because we're investors in them, and all of the advice and support and management, that just is part and parcel with us being a partner of the company.
And Raj, to think a little bit more about the role of venture capital in funding these companies, there was a pretty good discussion on Twitter the other day with Ian Roundtree talking about, is venture capital the right method to funding, these next defense companies, all the new companies, the new wave of companies that we need to revitalize national security. I'm curious if you have a take on, what the role of VC is, and what are the different sources of financing that we could be pursuing that is, if not venture capital.
Venture capital, I think, plays and has a very important role to play, but it's not the only source of financing out there, and not always the most appropriate source of financing, particularly in defense. So there are a lot of great defense companies that start more service-oriented because the defense part needs services. And those businesses are probably not appropriate for venture. And you can build a great, wonderful business that's making real impact using other sources. There are, if you're sometimes doing really large hardware or spinouts, there's later stage capital, there's corporate capital that can be very helpful. But I think, and of course, there's always the path of bootstrapping, which is a time and true way of building a company. But I think if you're building a business that you intend to scale very rapidly, that has a high technical hurdle where you have to recruit some of the best engineers in the world, be they software or hardware, and invest in building that moat before you can go to market, that's where venture capital plays a role. And it has historically for enterprise-focused companies, across the customer base, and folks that and supporting entrepreneurs have a really big vision of changing an industry that they're passionate about, and you want to partner. So I do think as software becomes more central to our capabilities in national defense, right? As I was a F-16 pilot. It's a great airplane, but really it's turned into a vehicle to move radars and electronics around, and the software behind it is just important, if not more important, than the hardware. That's the role that software-oriented companies that are venture backable can play.
Should venture capitalists that are looking to invest in this sector rethink the 10-year model of venture funds, or do you think that the 10-year model works just as fine to invest in these sectors?
These things are long lead times. Call it deep tech, hard tech. It's whatever the name du jour. These things do have long gestation, but that's not new. That's not a new concept, right? If you're investing in semiconductors back in the 80s, it's the same thing. So it's a different use case. So I think there's lots of options, and I think the finance world is different today as well. That you can stay private for a long time. There are ample sources of later stage capital. This last 6 months, the next 18 months notwithstanding, and there's lots of ways to find capital. So I don't think it's a impediment, and if there's something that has a longer gestation, there's ways to solve that structurally.
So to take a step back for a little bit and look at the other types of companies that are building technology for the government, and specifically talking about a lot of these prime contractors, they tend to get a bad rap from startups who are trying to compete with them. I'd love to learn a little bit more how you think they fit into this ecosystem, what needs to change, and how startups should actually embrace, or if they should embrace the primes for certain purposes.
Yeah, so my thinking on that is certainly involved, and I've come to the conclusion now that we talked about speed and scale again as what I think the two major rubrics are. I think for young startups, sometimes it's difficult to do that totally alone. And so if you found the right prime partner, you can get the advantages that working with a large prime can give you, which is so security clearances, the services, relationships, and you can focus, and the startup can then focus on what it's really good at, which is cutting edge, unique technology. Obviously I'm biased on that. Full disclosure, I so fundamentally believe in that model that one of our partners at Shield Capital is L3 Harris, and I think they are leaning forward in trying to do this and trying to partner with startups. But so I think it can be done. I think we actually did that at DIU when I was there, that we would sometimes take a large prime and a young startup and say, you guys need to work together and bid on this together. So I think that works really well. I think the challenge and why some primes get a bad rap is that they have leverage because of the contracts and because of the relationships. And so sometimes I think those primes are suffering from short-term thinking. Hey, I just need to maximize my margin on this one contract, and I don't care if that impales the young startup that's working with me. There'll be another one, and they don't, I think long term that, hey, these guys are going to grow, they're going to have the best tech, and you want to have a collaborative relationship with them. And so I'm optimistic that they'll get there. Not all of them will. You've seen that change in the private side, though, right? When young companies now work with some of the largest corporations, and of course everyone negotiates for the best deal, but they know that, hey, these startups are going to grow and succeed, and they want to have a good relationship. That's why they all have venture arms now. It's why they have partnerships. I don't think that all the primes have gotten there yet, but I think I'm starting to see some of them move in that direction.
So Raj, other than the scale of those primes and the difficulty that startups have in general of competing with them, and acknowledging the slowness of the process of working with the government, what are the general mistakes or errors that founders commit when thinking about primes and working with the government?
I think for startups, there's a couple of things that they need to think through. So one, certainly IP rights. The primes traditionally, again, using a model that was built in the hardware era, if we're going to work with someone, says, I want to have some IP here, I want to have some exclusivity or protection. So a startup has to navigate that, particularly, again, if their software and their IP is constantly changing, finding creative ways to understand who's going to be the prime versus the sub. And I think the other mistake, I wouldn't say it's a mistake, but maybe opportunity that goes missed is when we're thinking about net new programs or net new software programs. I think there's a great opportunity for startups to go direct to the government and win. And that's what a lot of our companies are doing. But there's also an opportunity to say, look, there's this massive hardware installed base in the government, right, or in the military, right? We got a whole bunch of old tanks and radios and systems. They're not going away. They're central to what we do. We need to improve their capability. There needs to be rapid software updates and adding of new functionality. You have to work with the original manufacturer of that oftentimes to get that to work. So I think being creative about those relationships and partnerships is the other thing that startups could do.
So we've definitely noticed a trend where more of these primes are now creating venture capital arms to invest in some of these startups.
Yeah.
What are the pros and cons of that?
Yeah, sure. So on a startup side, right, the pro is a source of capital and a deeper partnership. The cons are it's not always clear how well tied the venture arm is with the operating arm, and they may be at odds. The other downfall, or the other negative is Certainly, there's signaling impact from taking strategic money early in a company's life. And then the third one is, some of these venture arms at large companies, and you see that in the defense and non-defense world, are very tied to the current leadership, meaning you have a CEO that loves it, so it happens, and then you have a new CEO, and then the venture arm gets shut down, and that's not good for a startup. So I think you have to think very carefully about that. Again, it's not a commercial, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. So we tried to design a system that you would get the benefit, but avoid all of those negative factors I described.
And then there's definitely a little bit of a reputation in the space, or it seems like there's murmurs among companies that if they take the money, maybe it leads them towards an acquisition, or, it blocks them from working with other primes. Do you think that's a worry, or is that something that companies shouldn't be so worried about?
Especially early, that's always a worry. Again, that's not a defense-specific question or concern. It's true in all, I think, early-stage startups that if a likely acquirer is on your cap table early in your company, it may limit your exit options. What rights come associated with that. So I think you have to, especially in the early days, you do have to be very judicious as a startup founder.
And Raj, I don't know if this has been your experience as well, but I think over the last 6 months to a year, we've seen more and more venture investors coming from all different sorts of backgrounds, trying to invest in national security and defense. Maybe sparked by the Ukraine war, maybe sparked by a lot of other issues, right? What do you think could be the failure mode of investors that don't come from this space trying to invest in these industries?
Yeah, it's a good question. First off, I'm glad that more people are interested in it. Right? You don't want to be the only investor in a sector. You need friends to lead the other rounds and continue to support the company. So in general, I'm very glad to see this trend. I think that the failure mode is that defense is hard. You alluded to some of it from the contracting standpoint, the time horizon standpoint, and it's not it's a very esoteric, acronym-filled world, and it takes some time to, I think, really learn the ins and outs of it. And so I think one failure mode that I would fear is that you have some companies that struggle and you're not able to help, or it takes longer than you want, and you see some of these sources of capital decide to leave the market. So I think that's a failure mode. I think the other one is really, how well do they understand the customer, and are they able to filter what's a real demand signal from not?
And what do you think can those investors bring to the table that could help founders trying to build in those sectors? So, investors that invest in SaaS, that invest in all different sectors, what could, defense in, aerospace founders most benefit from them?
Look, I think there's a lot of those are very smart investors, and especially if you're also trying to sell commercially, the expertise and relationships from enterprise customers could be valuable. Sources, just good sources of capital, and again, you want really good people around your board advising and mentoring and helping your company. So sometimes a lot of this is based not just on even the firm, but who are you working with, right? Because you're gonna be stuck with that board member for a very long time. So you wanted to have a very positive and constructive relationship.
So, Raj, as we think about the capitalization structure of a lot of these companies, right, they're usually going to require larger sums of capital, given the nature of, as we talked about earlier, potentially taking longer to reach your fruition point, but also, as we mentioned earlier too, there's more hardware at play. For all of our listeners who are founders who are building companies and about to embark on this journey and need to raise more capital to actually pull this all off, is there anything in particular they should be looking for in their investors to make sure that they're able to kind of support that future capitalization?
And I think that's mostly true for hardware, as you described, Ian. I don't know if it's true for software. While some of the cycles are longer, if you're building really great software, there's oftentimes great commercial opportunities first. Like many of our cyber deals, we suggest they go commercially first and then DoD. So it's not always that way. And once you start with DoD or government, they're slow. But the good thing is they always pay on time, and they usually keep paying. So it can be positive. But to your point on, I think, hardware, I think it's really important that folks select investors that either have a reputation of deep pockets and following on, or just have a lot of great reputation in the industry, so people follow them, and they view them as a signal, because raising, especially for hardware, raising B and C rounds can become difficult, and you want to have the right supporters, rowing the boat with you. I think it is really important to, when you're looking at investors, to ask, in this space, two questions, right? One, does that investor really understand this customer set and can be helpful at that? But two, equally as important, is can they be helpful in the boardroom, just in company building, right? Because what I think the challenge in this market, which again I think scares a lot of people, why you've had sometimes mixed results, is that you're doing two really hard things at the same time. You're building a company from scratch, like that alone is super hard, and then you're trying to go and solve problems for probably the hardest customer in the world, and you're doing them, both in flight. And so if I was a founder, I'd ask myself, who's going to give me the most help to succeed and overcome these challenges?
And Raj, when you think about spaces to invest in that related to national security, are there any white spaces that you have not seen a lot of activity in that you're really excited about? And perhaps what about the opposite? Are there any spaces that you think are super saturated that, to go back to the previous question, that investors that are not as familiar are going to make a mistake of investing in it?
That's an interesting question. Again, going back to the portion we talked about how much the world has changed, I am just been pleasantly surprised to see how many companies are in this broad area of this nexus, national security and commercial. Unbelievably more than there were 5 years ago, with really, really great founders. So, I think all the areas are competitive, which is good. There are certainly specific white spaces inside all of them. I don't have any specific generalizations or to make there, but again, I think we're still in the early days of this bow wave, and I guess what I would say is, if you look at, let's just take one organization, the Department of Defense, right? Their annual budget is 770, maybe I think it's like $810 billion now. If they move just 1%, 0.5% of their budget towards these non-traditional, as they would call them, commercially oriented technologies, that's multi-billions of dollars of spend. And so I think we're still in the early days of seeing this market grow, and the same technologies that are so important for national security, let's think AI, let's think cyber, are still, I think, in their early days on the commercial side, which is even a larger market. So there's plenty of room for lots of winners. That's what I tell a founder.
So, in light of all of the challenges that our society and our nation face, all the technologies that you're helping fund that should solve these problems, when you take a step back, what keeps you optimistic looking at all of these issues that we're facing?
Yeah, so that's great. I think, to me, there's a couple of things, or probably two. So one is just meeting founders. Like, I just love meeting these founders that are passionate about the space, about what they're building, and their depth of knowledge, right? It's not misguided passion. So there's really, really strong people coming into it. And then I think second is, I'm seeing both at the really senior levels, so think 3-4 stars, as well as folks boots on the ground, the young enlisted officers that are keeping our nation safe, clamoring and asking for this type of capability. And so you're seeing a massive pool. And when you see it work, when you see a great founder build a technology, and then you see it make someone in the field's life better and better at their job, like, there's nothing more rewarding.
Incredible. And Raj, what would be your message to the audience and the founders that want to build in the space, but for whatever reason, do not think that they have the right background or the perfect match to build into one of those industries?
I'd give them two pieces of advice. One, just do it, and two, call me. Let's talk about it. We're happy to help.
I love it. And what would be the best way for founders to get in touch with you and Shield Capital?
Just send me an email. It's rshaw@shieldcap.com.
Incredible. Raj, thank you so much for coming to the podcast.
Thanks, Lucas. Thanks, Ian. I appreciate the opportunity.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Check us out at villageglobal.vc.